occasion to participate in an On Think Tanks conference. So I'm really looking forward to the next 2 days. Enrique asked me to speak to you a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing in the context of the G20 with think tanks, both within the G20 process, but also with think tanks across Africa, and looking at the extent to which we've been able to engage with the global audience. So I want to touch on 2 initiatives in particular, which are interlinked and which SAIIA has been involved in. The first is the T20 process. I think some of you may be familiar with it and may indeed be involved with it. And the second one is the T20 Africa Standing Group, which is about 2 years old now. And the 2 are related. And then this is part of a broader program that the Institute has been involved in now for probably 8 or 9 years, which is our Global Economic Governance Africa program. And so, just in case I'm stopped before I manage to finish all the points, some of my main messages, so this is the abstract, the executive summary, in terms of engaging a global audience. I think the first point from our perspective has been the extent to which one can broaden the think tank discussion on these issues to beyond G20 countries, because G20 issues are not only for G20 countries. The second one is creating a platform for G20 think tanks and African think tanks to exchange, debate, and develop common recommendations within the opportunities presented in the G20 and the Think20, and then taking that message to, and I'm using the term here in the way that Keith used it from Chatham House last night, interested publics in other African countries that are not G20 members. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit then about the T20 process. I think many of you may be aware that this is one of the engagement groups of the G20 process. It was established in 2012 during the Mexican presidency, but I think it's fair to say it's really grown in size and in stature. Perhaps the turning point was the way in which the Germans took the Think20 process when they were chairing it in 2017. I think elevated to a really much bigger enterprise, gave it more structure and focused, produced something like 75 policy briefings and 10 task forces. So really a big affair. And I think the Argentines built on that, and it seems that the Japanese are doing the same. In that same year, in 2017, on the initiative of the German Development Institute, which was the co-chair of the Think20 process that year, there was an initiative to establish the T20, so the Think20 Africa Standing Group, with the thinking that Africa, with the exception of South Africa, really isn't represented in G20 discussions. The think tanks are not also contributing to it, and yet a lot of the issues have a direct bearing, as they do, in fact, for many developing countries, on Africa. So how do we create a community of researchers and think tankers actually thinking about these issues? In true form, of course, there is a structure. In true German form, there is a structure. There's a governance board. SAIIA serves on the secretariat, and the governance board comprises a troika of G20 countries and a troika of African countries. And so the troika of G20 at the moment would be Argentina, Japan, and Saudi. And in the African context, it's 3 other think tanks from across the continent. So it's intended really to create a policy community that brings together both African think tanks, but also G20 think tanks. It's no use us having a conversation among ourselves as African think tanks on many of these issues. So, you know, we exchange perspectives, we debate, we do a little bit of research on issues that are on the agenda, and hopefully come out with a better understanding of each other also on these things. So we, as an institute, we've been involved with the G20 now for some years, as I said, since about 2009. At the time, it was part of our thinking was indeed to create a gig Africa network, bringing together other African think tanks and the media in African countries to generate a local debate on these issues beyond South Africa. And at the time, I think we'd brought together about 8 or so African think tanks. but there wasn't really the opportunity to feed formally into a process. And I think the way in which the Germans constructed and used the T20 platform to build an Africa standing group, I think has created such an avenue. And so two important points here that I want to stress: resources and policy platforms are important. So having the resources, but then also having the platform. In the early part, we had some of the resources, we didn't have the platform, and I think hopefully we've combined the two, but let's see what that means going into the future. So the question is then, how have we reached out to a global audience? As I think many of you will appreciate, many of the issues that the G20 tackles are really highly specialized and technical. And of course, they also only usually include a small group of countries. But their impact is wide-ranging, both in terms of norms, regulations, systems, and so on and so forth. But it's really a difficult story to tell to the broader public. You know, we were talking yesterday about the issue of storytelling. Let's see what inroads we've made in a more sort of limited and defined framework. I think for us, what has been important is to reach out to think tanks in other African countries, other African policymakers, as well as institutions on the continent such as the African Union and NEPAD, and bringing them together with G20 think tanks to actually have discussions about many of these global issues and how they impact, or how Africa sees these and what its concerns are. Let me just move a little quickly on this. I think one of the challenges that we have found in that sort of outreach has been the difficulty of identifying potential partners who were not necessarily historically following many of these global economic governance issues, but who were following economic debates in the African context. And the way in which we did that, really about sort of widening our policy circle and our engagement, is bring them into our conferences, incorporating them into an advisory board on the research agenda, including them in the research we were undertaking, organizing joint events in those countries, bringing the policymakers of those other African countries into some of these discussions. So sort of, you know, working at broadening the borders of the global economic governance G20 community. But I think what was also very useful for us in those early years was we needed to listen to what they were telling us about the debates and the themes that would have resonance in countries, whether it was Nigeria or Ghana or Kenya, etc. You know, we went in there with a South African mentality about engaging on global governance, but it was also important to make the global relevant to the local. And that is also part of the storytelling and how you tell send a compelling message on issues that are often highly technical. So why does it matter, for example, for informed publics in Kenya to be interested about base erosion and profit shifting? You know, well, it's relevant in the context of tax revenue. It's relevant in the context of the state being able to deliver, and so on. And another point then that comes out of the way in which we try to broaden that is the importance of playing a convening role. And again, we heard about that yesterday. The ability to bring together different stakeholders who ordinarily would not be sitting in the same room, or if they were doing the convening, it might be a little bit more sensitive or a little bit more difficult to have an open discussion. And so the initiatives around these policy platforms of the T20, I think, have created the opportunities for some of these discussions. They don't necessarily mean, by definition, that you're fully engaged and bringing in all the global audience that you want, but it certainly creates an enabling environment. So, let me move on to my conclusion. What does this mean for wider audience or participants in our policy engagements as we look to the future? I want to make 5 quick points. I think the first one relates to the importance of more systematic collaboration, and I think systematic is important here, among think tanks in Africa on global issues that are on the G20 agenda. So not just on issues that are continent-specific. We tend to focus on, you know, Agenda 2063, which is important and has a global bridge to the issues on the G20, but I think we need to think also more globally and do this in a systematic fashion. The second one is really using the above as a springboard for providing a support function to some of our continental institutions that also have a critical role to play in many of these discussions. So to resource them properly to support their respective chairs. So if we're looking at the African Union or NEPAD, we need to be actually, as think tanks in Africa, working together with also other G20 think tanks to be providing relevant policy, evidence-based research that relates to policy. Thirdly, the opportunity for deep dive engagements with think tanks of African countries that are actually chairing the AU. So this year, for example, it would be, or last year, would be Rwanda chairing the African Union and Senegal chairing NEPAD. How do we work together with these in terms of generating a debate in those countries on issues that their presidents will be sitting around the table to discuss as observers at the G20? Fourthly, from an African think tank perspective, we also need to be more proactive in engaging with our respective governments and other G20 actors across the board, such as the business community, on a more regular basis. It's not sufficient to simply produce policy briefings, and we know that all, even if it goes through a platform such as the T20 and think that that is what will suffice. So it's an ongoing engagement, and we need resources to do that. And a strategy. And lastly, from a resource perspective and funding, helping the T20 Africa Standing Group network engage with the global audience, also in G20 countries and beyond, in terms of how we tackle the issue of more effective communications. And then as a subcategory of that, how can we pool resources from a communications perspective and social media perspective more broadly that may help us to raise our engagement? One possibility might be for us to leverage existing initiatives within the African think tank space, such as, for example, an initiative that SAIIA is involved in with the Canadian-based think tank CG, the Centre for International Governance Innovation, which is also part of the G20 think tank group, what we call the Africa Portal, that brings together over 80 think tanks, largely from Africa, with the idea of being a one-stop shop for research output. But how do we really strategize about creating platforms such as these, where we don't all have to reinvent the wheel, but actually be able to draw in more engagement on that platform?
Fantastic. Okay. Yes, this is probably the first.